Welcome to another lecture by MedicoMedics, Learning Made Easy. Physiology, Chapter 2, Cell Physiology and Membrane Dynamics. In this lecture, we will discuss the cell, which is the basic unit of life. Present the cell membrane, talk about functions of this membrane, present the concepts of passive transport and active transport, cell signaling, and end with a summary. Now, cells are the smallest structural and functional units of life. In the human body, we have trillions of cells, each specialized for unique functions. For example, we have neurons, nerve cells, for communication. We have muscle cells for movement, etc. To understand how cells work, we first need to explore their boundaries, meaning the cell membrane. Now, the cell membrane is like a security gate. It controls what comes in and what goes out of the cell. It is made of a phospholipid bilayer. So we have the outer layer, as you can see in the illustration here, which is the heads facing outwards. These are hydrophilic, so they're friendly to water. And you have the other head right here. Then we have these tails pointing inwards, where they connect with one another, creating this double layer. Now this layer inwards is water-fearing or hydrophobic. Now this immediately creates a very strong barrier between what can go in and what can go out. So naturally then, we would assume that there are different pathways for things to move in and out of cells. So we have embedded proteins serving as gates or channels and receptors. As you can see them, for example, right here and here. Cholesterol provides flexibility and stability to the cell membrane. We have carbohydrates that aid in cell recognition and communication. So there are a lot of important structures involved on the cell membrane. We have very sophisticated methods for bringing things into the cell and having things leave the cell. Like, for example, one way for the cell to know that whatever is on the outside is supposed to come in is that while it's floating about on the outside, it needs to become recognized by something. So we have these receptors sitting on the cell membrane. Now, the structure of the membrane defines how it functions. So let's examine these functions further. So we have a barrier which protects the internal components of the cell from the external environment. There is selective permeability, meaning we allow certain substances to pass, like oxygen and nutrients. But as the name goes, it's selective. We have communication, so membrane proteins send and receive signals, for example, hormone receptors. There is transport going on, which facilitates movements of molecules through two main ways of transport. One is passive transport, whereby no energy is required. The processes here worth mentioning are diffusion, osmosis, or facilitated diffusion, etc. These do not require energy to diffuse into the cell membrane, through the cell membrane. Then we have active transport. Here, energy is required. An example of this is the sodium-potassium pump. So let's start by talking about passive transport. So molecules move from high to low concentration down the gradient. For this, no energy is required. Types include simple diffusion, so small molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide pass through the membrane. We have facilitated diffusion, where larger or charged molecules like glucose or ions using protein channels or carriers to get through. Then we have osmosis, so the movement of water across the membrane through aquaporins. Here you have examples of molecules from high concentration diffusing to low concentration. And osmosis, water molecules diffusing in, moving across the membrane freely, easily. So passive transport is like, imagine you have this hill and you're up here and you're starting to fall downwards. Now you don't need any energy you just let essentially gravity pull this stone downwards. But not all transport works this way. Not all transport is passive. Some, as we mentioned, as what we call active transport, actually does require energy. So let's discuss active transport. Now, active transport, molecules moving from low to high concentration, so against the gradient. And this will require ATP, energy. An example, as we mentioned, is the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump pumps 3 sodiums out of the cell and 2 potassium enters the cell. This maintains the cell's electrical gradient. This is not something you need to understand fully now, but will as we move along in the lecture series. But just know that this pump is crucial and vital for processes like nerve signal transmission and muscle contraction, etc. But what you need to pick up here is that getting across the membrane either goes without energy, which means there are ways for it to diffuse into it. We then have other ways where we need energy to get through because there is some kind of resistance. The gradient is higher on the other side, creating an obstacle for this thing to get in. So we utilize energy to do that. Here you can imagine that hill again, only this time you're pushing that stone upwards. If you let go, it will fall back down. So you need to utilize your energy to push it up. So the transport process itself is one part of cell membrane dynamics. Next, we will look at how cells communicate through signaling. Now, cells communicate through chemical signals, like hormones and neurotransmitters. Now, there are steps involved in cell signaling. So first, we have reception, where the signal binds to the receptor on the cell membrane. If you remember from the previous slide, we had an illustration where we had the cell membrane and receptors on it. And we said things float outside of the cell. These receptors are supposed to pick up whatever specific ligand or molecule it is that is supposed to enter the cell. Once this has binded, and you can see this illustrated here. So any molecule or ligand, as illustrated here in blue, binds to the receptor. That's step one. Then what happens is called transduction. So that signal then is converted into an internal message. So that message goes and gets relayed into the cell. And what happens is that you will have a response. So the cell performs a specific action, like producing insulin or cell division or whatever. So whatever that message was becomes internalized and leads to a response. So it's like making a phone call. Cells send messages to each other to coordinate actions. So in summary then, the cell membrane is essential for protection, transport, and communication. We said for the protective part, it is made of a phospholipid bilayer that has a hydrophilic outside and a hydrophobic inside. And this in of itself creates a gateway that is indeed protected from things that are not supposed to enter the cell. So for that to still happen, we need ways to transport whatever is on the outside to get in, and vice versa. But for that to occur, for things to bind to the cell membrane, to create an action on the inside of the cell, a response, we need communication. So transport mechanisms were divided into passive transport and active, where passive transport did not need ATP, like osmosis or diffusion, something moving from a high gradient to a lower one. But we also have active transport, where you're moving against the gradient. You're pushing something uphill. You need to utilize energy to get that done. And one very crucial and central pump in our cells is the sodium-potassium pump. Vital for life. It utilizes active transport. So you can imagine and speculate, if our body doesn't produce, for whatever reason, enough ATP, will these pumps function? That will affect them. And what are the consequences of that throughout our body? Then we have cell signaling, which enables coordination within and between different systems. And the steps included were reception, transduction, and response. And that's the end of lecture 2. Continue now to lecture 3.